The wrinkled scrubs hung on Rachel Torres like an apology she hadn't made yet. Cedar Creek Medical's fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous prayer over the ER as she moved through the morning shift like smoke, present but unnoticed, competent but deliberately invisible. Other staff bumped into her without acknowledgement. A resident stepped directly in front of her at the supply station, forcing her to swerve left, and didn't glance back. Rachel steadied herself against the counter, adjusted the blood pressure cuff in her hands, and continued to the next room as though she'd been the one in their way all along. 8 months at Cedar Creek. 8 months of keeping her head down, her voice soft, her past buried so deep under layers of deliberate mediocrity that no one, not the attending physicians, not the charge nurse, not the hospital administrator reviewing her hiring file, thought to look twice. Her badge read R. Torres, RN. Just that. No credentials to challenge, no accomplishments to resent, no reason for anyone to wonder why a nurse in her early 40s moved with the economical precision of someone trained to operate in urban warfare. Room 312 needed post-op vitals. Rachel knocked twice, entered without waiting for permission, and found a middle-aged woman pale against the pillows, her surgical dressing already showing the first hints of pink. Rachel's hands moved without hesitation. Blood pressure cuff. Pulse oximetry. The practice movements of someone who had held people together in worse light than a hospital room. She spoke in fragments, her voice barely above a whisper. Breathe slowly. Pain level. On a scale of 1 to 10. The patient answered. Rachel documented. Moved on. By 7:15 a.m., she had already assessed 8 patients, caught a medication error, dopamine dosage written for a renal failure patient who couldn't tolerate it, and corrected it silently by speaking directly to the pharmacy. No confrontation. No need to inform the attending. The error disappeared before it could hurt anyone. This was her method: fix the problem, leave no fingerprints, never let anyone know you were there. She hung her jacket in locker 34 in the back nurse's station, a thin Columbia windbreaker with a small tear in the right pocket. When she draped it over the hook, the lining caught for just a moment on the metal edge. The brief exposure revealed what she kept closest to her chest, a faded unit patch sewn into the interior, the stitching careful and deliberate, done by someone who knew the value of what they were protecting. Special Forces. Ramadi. 6 years ago, a world away. The patch showed desert fading to grey, the edges worn soft from hands that had touched it in the darkness, in the silence of 3 a.m., when she was alone enough to remember what she wasn't supposed to be anymore. Rachel smoothed the jacket quickly, covered the patch, stepped back. Her fingers found the scar on her left wrist, a thin line of pale tissue that curved like a crescent moon, and she pressed her thumb against it, a habit, a grounding. The tremor came only when she was alone. In public, the tremor never came. In room 347, Colonel James Webb lay in the hospital bed recovering from a motor vehicle collision that had thrown his Jeep into a drainage ditch on I-285 3 days prior. He had 3 broken ribs, a fractured scapula, and a concussion that the attending insisted required another 48 hours of observation. Webb had no argument with the timeline. At 58 years old, with 32 years of service spanning 2 wars and counting, he understood the value of patience. What he didn't understand was why a temp nurse in wrinkled scrubs moved like a soldier. He'd been watching her since dawn. The way she entered rooms, always assessing exits first, her eyes tracking the placement of windows, the distance to doors, the position of equipment that could become a weapon or a shield. The way she calculated angles with her shoulders before turning. The way her breathing remained controlled even when she was clearly tired, her voice never rising above the volume necessary to be heard. The way she looked at pain not as suffering but as data. Webb had spent 32 years with soldiers. He recognized the bearing. He recognized the stillness that comes from training, not from shyness. And he recognized something else, the way she wore her ordinariness like body armor, making herself small enough that the world's eyes slid past her without catching. He had seen that mask before. He had worn it himself. When Rachel passed his doorway at 7:16 a.m. with a fresh fur bag, routine maintenance, barely a glance required, Webb noticed something else. The way her hand moved. Not the tremor, though he saw that too, the small involuntary shake that betrayed something underneath. But the way the tendons in her forearm aligned when she reached, the precision of her movements, the absence of wasted motion. Combat medicine training. Trauma assessment under pressure. Muscle memory that didn't fade, no matter how many years you let yourself disappear. Webb closed his eyes and made a decision he wouldn't question until much later. He would keep watching. And he would wait. Meanwhile, Dr. Mercer stood at the nurse's station with his phone pressed to his ear, his jaw working like he was chewing something bitter. He watched Rachel move through the ER with the intensity of a predator tracking prey that had no idea it was being hunted. The thing that made his hands tighten into fists wasn't her competence. It was that no one else seemed to notice it. The residents asked her questions. The attending physicians followed her assessments without realizing they were following assessments. Patients calmed when she entered rooms, their blood pressure dropping, their anxiety fading, as if her presence alone carried some kind of authority that had nothing to do with the credentials on her badge. And she had the wrong credentials. Or no credentials. Or forged credentials. Mercer hadn't quite settled on the narrative yet, but the form he was filling out would make the distinction irrelevant. All it needed was a seed. A whisper. A question carefully planted in the right ears. "I'm just saying," Mercer said into the phone, his voice pitched low, the tone of a concerned colleague sharing a troubling observation. "You don't usually see clinical judgment like that without a 4-year degree. Maybe she did the online program, but nobody's heard of her from any of the usual schools. And that's fine. Totally fine. But when you ask around, when you actually dig into it," he paused, letting silence do the heavy lifting. "I'm not saying anything definitive. I'm just wondering out loud. That's all." He ended the call and deleted the transcript from his phone's history. The seed was planted. From here, it would grow on its own. He'd seen this technique work 100 times, the casual doubt, the gentle insinuation, the implication that someone had done something just enough outside the lines that it warranted investigation. By the time anyone actually dug into Rachel's file, and they would, because people always did when a colleague raised just enough concern, the damage would be done. Her credibility would be questioned. Her clinical decisions would be scrutinized. Patients would start asking about her qualifications. And the hospital's liability team, ever careful, would begin to distance themselves. All from someone who had simply wondered out loud. Rachel felt the shift in the room's temperature around 8:20 a.m., though she wouldn't have called it that if anyone asked. Felt wasn't the right word. Clinical observation was better. The way other nurses' eyes changed when she approached, moving from neutral to guarded. The way the resident, a 4th year from Emory named Chen, suddenly asked to review her assessment notes from room 309 instead of just accepting them. The way Mercer caught her eye from across the station and held it just long enough to communicate something that had nothing to do with patient care. Rachel's hands continued moving. Charts to update. Meds to deliver. A patient in 314 whose post-op pain was climbing and whose prescribed fentanyl dose looked conservative for a man his size. She flagged it anyway, noted it in the chart, and let the attending make the call. Never initiate the change. Always suggest the possibility. Let someone else own the decision. This was the invisible dance of being invisible, the constant calculation of how much competence you could display before it became threatening. She had learned this in Ramadi, though Ramadi had taught it in a different language. There, the lesson was about moving through hostile territory without drawing fire. Here, the lesson was the same. Move through space without becoming visible. Help without claiming credit. No more than you reveal. By 10:15 a.m., the rumor was already circulating through the nursing staff like a virus. Rachel's certification. The question of whether she'd actually completed the program. The vague suggestion that something didn't add up. Rachel heard it only in fragments, a dropped name here, a meaningful pause there, because she made sure never to be anywhere long enough to hear the complete version. And when she heard it, she simply kept working. Kept her voice soft. Kept her hand steady. Let the doubt settle into the air without acknowledging it had landed on her at all. In room 347, Colonel Webb listened to his physical therapist torture his ribs with gentle exercises and thought about a mission in Ramadi that had gone sideways in the summer of 2009. 3 convoys. 23 soldiers. A female captain with a call sign like something out of a ghost story, Phantom. Webb had been major then, junior enough that he mostly stayed in the TOC, the Tactical Operations Center, but experienced enough that he understood what he was watching when she coordinated the extraction. The way she moved 12 wounded soldiers out of an ambush zone while insurgents had fire superiority. The way she'd carried a staff sergeant who'd taken shrapnel through the spine. The way she'd stayed in the kill zone an extra 60 seconds because someone had lost a radio and refused to abandon the equipment because that radio contained intelligence about a weapons cache that could have killed 1,000 more. She'd earned a Silver Star for that. Webb had read the citation. Didn't know her name then, didn't need to. Knew her call sign was Phantom. Knew she'd gone dark after 2010, the way some operators did. Some people were just too sharp, too dangerous, too valuable to keep in the regular channels. Those people disappeared into special assignments. Vanished into files marked classified. Became legends that only the people who'd served beside them remembered. Webb had assumed she was dead. Or in prison. Or working for the CIA in some capacity that would never be declassified. He had not assumed she was working as a temp nurse in an Atlanta ER in wrinkled scrubs. The physical therapist left at 10:45. Webb pulled the call button at 10:50 and waited. Rachel arrived at 10:52, moving with that economical precision he'd been studying for 3 days. He didn't ask her name yet. He didn't ask her anything that would betray what he suspected. He simply asked for water, and while she adjusted his pillow and refilled his cup, he watched the tendons in her hands and knew. The precision of movement. The muscle memory. The way her eyes assessed the room even while her voice remained soft and deferential. He waited for her to leave, then closed his eyes and began a calculation that would take him the rest of the day to work out. If this was the woman he thought she was, and Webb's instincts had kept him alive through 2 wars, so he trusted them, then Cedar Creek Medical had just become ground zero for something nobody at this hospital understood yet. The question wasn't whether Rachel Torres was who he thought she was. The question was, who else in this hospital was about to find out? The bleeding started small. Room 12, post-surgical recovery, the Hendricks family's father, a construction foreman named David, 3 hours out from a routine hernia repair that should have been nothing. Rachel noticed the vital sign trend first. Blood pressure drifting down. Heart rate creeping up. The monitor beeping its quiet alarm that everyone else had learned to ignore. She checked the surgical site. The bandage was soaked through. Not oozing. Not weeping. Actively bleeding from beneath the incision line where the sutures had separated. She didn't page Dr. Mercer. She didn't wait for authorization. She grabbed a pressure dressing, sterile gauze, and a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart, moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this in field conditions with artillery incoming. 2 minutes later, she had the bleeding controlled, the for running normal saline through the line, blood pressure stabilizing. 98/60. 100/62. 102/64. Climbing. Safe. The family watched her, David's wife, 2 adult sons, their faces shifting from panic to something like relief. The youngest son said quietly, "Thank you." Rachel nodded once and continued her work, checking the dressing, verifying the flow rate, making notes on the monitor. She didn't see Dr. Mercer arrive. Didn't hear his footsteps. Suddenly he was there in the doorway, his eye scanning the room, the open gauze packets, the 4 setup, the dressing she'd applied with precision that looked nothing like a nurse's work. It looked like surgery. He stared at her hands for 3 seconds. Then he turned to the Hendricks family with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I apologize," he said, his voice smooth as oil, "that our unlicensed staff decided to exceed her training." The word hung in the air like poison gas. Unlicensed. The accusation landed exactly where he'd aimed it, straight at the family's trust. His mouth moved, forming sympathy. "I'll be reviewing whether Ms. Torres here actually possesses the credentials she claims to have." Rachel stood motionless beside the four-pole. Her dark eyes went flat. Winter stone. Expressionless as a surveillance camera. Mrs. Hendricks made a small sound of distress, her hand reaching for David's arm. Dr. Mercer continued, addressing the family with practiced concern, using the language of institutional authority, hospital protocols, scope of practice, patient safety, each phrase designed to plant doubt in people already frightened. He was good at this. He'd had 8 months of practice. Rachel's breathing remained controlled. Mechanical. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Every muscle fiber locked down tight as a tourniquet, holding back something vast and dangerous that lived just beneath her skin, the part of her that had carried a rifle through Ramadi, that had made decisions that ended lives and saved lives in the same breath. That part wanted to speak. Wanted to explain credentials that couldn't be spoken, experience that couldn't be verified, a call sign that belonged to a ghost. But she said nothing. She let him talk until his voice ran dry and the silence stretched long enough that even he could feel it. Then she said, "If humiliating me makes you feel competent, doctor, I'll let you have today." Each word perfectly spaced. No emotion. No plea. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered in a voice that sounded like it was coming from another room, from another version of herself, the one who'd commanded 17 soldiers through hostile territory and brought 14 of them home. She turned on her heel and walked out of room 12 while Mercer's mouth was still open, his response unborn, his authority suddenly feeling very small and very fragile. His face flushed crimson the moment the door closed. 2 days passed. 2 days of silence and strategic rearrangement. By the third morning, Dr. Mercer had escalated. The unit board, the place where schedules and reminders were posted, now featured a written warning in his handwriting, laminated and pinned front and center where every staff member would see it. Rachel Torres, insubordination. Correcting physician's orders without authorization during shift of 11/14. This constitutes a direct violation of Hospital Protocol Section 4.2. Formal disciplinary review pending. He turned her intervention into a crime. The dosage error she'd caught, the error that would have stopped David Hendricks breathing, had become her offense. She read it in the break room during her 15-minute shift change. The conversation died the moment she entered. 3 nurses stood abruptly, grabbed their lunch containers, and left without looking in her direction. One muttered "forger" just loud enough to carry. The word followed Rachel like a scent. Forger. Unqualified. Dangerous. She sat at the empty table, opened her lunch, a protein bar and black coffee, and ate in silence, her jaw muscles working mechanically through each bite while the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like trapped insects. The medication room. Late afternoon. She was restocking the narcotics cabinet when Mercer appeared in the doorway, his body language casual, his smile carrying the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you control the institutional machinery. He leaned against the frame like he had all the time in the world. "You're too calm during traumas, Torres," he said, his voice conversational. "It's unnatural. Makes me wonder what you're hiding, Phantom Nurse." He smirked at his own nickname, proud of it, like he'd discovered something brilliant. The word hung there, phantom, testing the waters, fishing for reactions. Rachel held his gaze for 5 full seconds. Her breathing never changed. "If humiliating me makes you feel competent, doctor, I'll let you have today." She hadn't moved. Hadn't shifted her weight. Hadn't even blinked. When she finally turned and walked away, passing him in the doorway so close he could smell the antiseptic on her scrubs, his face flushed crimson for the second time in 2 days. But that wasn't the worst part for him. The worst part was that everyone in the hallway, 3 nurses, a resident, a medication tech, had heard the entire exchange, and the look on his face as she walked away had told them something his words never could. Something fundamental had shifted in the power balance. A physician had just been dismissed by his subordinate, and somewhere in that dismissal was a truth he couldn't articulate or defend against. That truth was about to change everything. The afternoon shift was 3 hours in when the ER doors exploded inward with a crash that echoed through the entire emergency department like a mortar round hitting tile. Everyone froze. The sound wasn't normal. Wasn't part of the hospital's white noise of beeping monitors and rolling stretchers and muffled conversations. It was violence. A massive man stood in the doorway, 6'4", 250 at minimum, his frame running to fat and muscle in equal measure, his eyes wild and wet with the specific desperation of chemical dependency. He was waving a pistol like he was learning gravity for the first time, his movements erratic, unpredictable. His voice came next, a roar that silenced the entire department. "Opioids! Now! I need them now!" The triage desk scattered. Security hadn't been called yet. Nobody had hit the panic button. Everyone was still in that first stunned second where the brain hasn't caught up to reality. A pregnant nurse named Kim, 7 months, due in December, stood directly in the gunman's path about 15 feet from the entrance. Her hands moved instinctively to cover her belly. Her eyes were wide. Rachel was organizing supply carts near the medication room, 10 feet away, her back to the commotion when her body registered the sound signature. Not a door. Not anything normal. Her hands went still. Her breathing didn't change. The recognition was instantaneous, the acoustic profile of a .40 caliber handgun, the timbre of genuine threat, not posturing. Her muscle memory didn't wait for a decision tree. It took over. She moved. Not running. Moving with the controlled fluidity of someone whose training had calcified into bone-deep reflex. For steps to Kim. Her body positioned itself between the pregnant nurse and the gunman, her hands raised in a non-threatening gesture, her voice dropping to a low frequency that cut through the chaos. "Sir, let's talk about what you need." Calm. Present. Not a plea. The tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The gunman's drug-addled brain didn't process the de-escalation. It processed only threat. He lunged forward, his arm swinging wild, the pistol grip catching Rachel across the jaw with a crack that echoed off the tile walls like a bat hitting bone. Her head snapped sideways. Blood appeared at the corner of her mouth, bright red, metallic tasting. Behind a supply cart 15 feet away, Dr. Mercer crouched with his phone, whispering lockdown protocols to someone, his hands shaking visibly. The gunman stepped forward again, his breathing ragged, his eyes locked on Rachel. Something shifted in her posture then. Weight transferred to the balls of her feet. Center of gravity dropped. Her eyes focused with the predatory precision of apex predators locked onto prey. When he lunged the second time, her body moved like water, no tension, no hesitation. She trapped his wrist with her left hand, the grip calibrated for maximum mechanical advantage, and torqued his arm backward with surgical precision that came from knowledge of joint mechanics learned in field medicine. His fingers spasmed open. The pistol clattered to linoleum with a sound like coins dropped on tile. Before he could register the loss of the weapon, Rachel drove her knee into his solar plexus with the kind of force designed to incapacitate without killing. He dropped to the floor gasping, his lungs empty, his diaphragm stunned. She had him face down with his arm locked in a restraint hold before hospital security even moved, a knee across his spine, his wrist pinned. The entire confrontation lasted 11 seconds. The emergency department stood frozen. Monitors beeped. Ventilators hummed their mechanical rhythm. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Dr. Mercer emerged from behind the supply cart, his face pale, his phone still in his hand, the security officer looking at Rachel like he'd just watched someone walk into water and vanish. The ER doors exploded inward like a breech charge, and the man who came through them belonged in a different building, the kind with bars on the windows. 6'4", 250 minimum, chest heaving inside a sweat-soaked tank top, eyes moving too fast, jaw clenched around words that came out as a roar. His right hand held a pistol. His left hand swung like he was testing the weight of it against the air itself. "Opioids. I want oxycodone." 50 tablets, right now, or I start with the pregnant ones. The triage desk nurse froze mid-keystroke. The waiting room, 14 people, including a woman in her third trimester sitting 3 feet from the main entrance, went absolutely silent. That specific silence. The kind where a drop pen sounds like a rifle shot. Dr. Mercer's reaction was immediate and instinctive. He bolted. Not toward the threat. Away from it. His shoes squeaked on the tile as he scrambled behind a supply cart near the medication station, his phone already pressed to his ear. His voice came out high-pitched, controlled but barely. Code Silver, full lockdown. We have an active shooter, ER main entrance, male, armed, demanding controlled substances. Rachel didn't hear the rest. She was already moving. Not running. Not diving for cover like everyone else was now, staff pressing themselves against walls, patients sliding out of chairs and crawling toward the nearest shelters. Rachel moved like someone stepping into cold water, one decision made and every muscle already committed to what came next. 3 steps. 4. The pregnant nurse, Sandra, name tag visible, hand shaking as she tried to back away from the desk, was directly in the gunman's line of sight. Rachel placed herself between them. The gunman's eyes snapped to her like she'd just materialized. For half a second, his whole body went rigid. He was expecting surrender. Expecting screams. Not expecting a temp nurse in purple scrubs to stand motionless in front of him with her hands visible and her chin level. "Sir, I'm going to," she started. His first swing was wild, fueled by adrenaline and whatever cocktail of substances had turned his pupils into pinpricks. His fist came around like a hammer, and he'd clearly done this before. There was weight behind it, experience in the arc. Rachel couldn't dodge it. Couldn't step aside without abandoning Sandra to the next swing. So she didn't. The impact caught her across the left jawline and sent her head snapping sideways. Blood filled her mouth, copper and salt and iron. Her vision sparkled at the edges. The side of her face went numb, then started burning with the precise clarity of a fresh injury beginning to understand itself. But something else happened too. Something that had been sleeping inside her chest for 8 months. Her hands moved on their own. Not the hands of a temp nurse. The hands of someone who'd trained for this exact scenario 6,000 times, who'd spent 18 months in Ramadi learning to move faster than conscious thought could travel. She caught his right wrist, the one holding the pistol, and twisted it backward with controlled violence that was anything but accidental. The gun clattered to the linoleum like dropped silverware. His momentum carried him forward into her shoulder, and she pivoted, using his own weight against him like turning a car through a narrow intersection. One knee. Driven upward into his solar plexus with the kind of precision that medical training and combat training required, far enough to incapacitate, not far enough to rupture organs, not far enough to leave evidence that would require paperwork explaining how a registered nurse knew exactly where to apply lethal force without actually applying lethal force. He hit the ground gasping, his lungs empty, his diaphragm locked in shock. Gasping like a fish pulled from water. Making sounds that weren't quite words, weren't quite screams. Security arrived in 40 seconds, 2 officers who'd been eating sandwiches in the break room, now moving with purpose. One of them kicked the pistol further away, toward the wall. The other secured the gunman's wrists behind his back with practiced efficiency. Nobody had fired a shot. Nobody else had been touched. The waiting room remained frozen, 14 pairs of eyes tracking Rachel like she'd just committed a magic trick and they were trying to figure out which moment they'd blinked. The pregnant nurse, Sandra, was still breathing. Still standing. Still alive because Rachel had moved. Rachel touched her jaw with the tips of her fingers and felt the swelling already rising like she'd been stung by something with teeth. Blood was going to show on her scrubs. Witnesses everywhere. No ambiguity about what had happened or who had done it. Dr. Mercer emerged from behind the supply cart, his face the color of old medical tape, his phone still pressed to his ear. He lowered it slowly. The security officer looking at Rachel had an expression like he'd just watched someone walk into water and then vanish entirely, leaving only ripples. The phone in the administrative offices rang at 3:27 p.m., while Director Hammond was still reviewing incident reports from the morning shift. It was Dr. Mercer calling from the ER, his voice pitched lower now, thoughtful, the panic replaced with something colder and more calculated. Hammond listened for 90 seconds, then hung up and opened his computer. By 4:15, Mercer had spread 7 incident reports across Hammond's desk like a solitaire hand. Each one was highlighted, annotated, dated. The first one cited Hospital Regulation 47C, subsection 3, unauthorized physical intervention with violent individuals. The second one referenced her lack of proper credentials in de-escalation protocols. The third cited the assault on hospital grounds, making Cedar Creek Medical potentially liable for her actions. The fourth highlighted the weapon discharge risk, technically no discharge, but grossly negligent physical contact with an armed individual that could have resulted in accidental discharge and mass casualties. She violated every protocol we have, Mercer was saying, his hand steepled in front of his chest. Physical intervention is absolutely prohibited. We have trained de-escalation specialists for this exact scenario. She could have gotten everyone killed. And where does a temporary nurse, someone who submitted forged credentials, I might add, learn to move like that? To disarm someone with military precision. Hammond rubbed his temples. Robert, she stopped an active shooter from. She created liability. She exposed us to wrongful death suits, workplace safety violations, and potentially criminal negligence on her part. One of those bullets could have ricocheted. One of those rounds could have hit a patient. Mercer leaned back in his chair like a lawyer resting his case. I want her terminated by end of shift. For cause. I'll handle the OSHA report personally. Hammond looked down at the highlighted regulations. Regulation 47C was real. It was also rarely enforced because of situations exactly like this one, because sometimes the protocols needed to be broken. But Mercer had built his fortress carefully. Each wall supported the next. I'll speak with her, Hammond said quietly. In room 347, Colonel Marcus Webb was scrolling through old photographs on his phone. Combat photos. Unit photos. Ramadi, 2008. His entire platoon arranged in front of a Humvee, sand dunes stretching behind them, everyone squinting against the sun and trying to look less exhausted than they felt. He'd studied this photo 1,000 times in the last 6 years. One face in particular. Third from the left. Female. Dark eyes. Built lean. The kind of presence that made everyone around her stand a little straighter. His finger stopped on that face. Captain Rachel Torres. Call sign Phantom. She'd extracted 12 wounded Marines under fire when their convoy got ambushed 2 miles outside Ramadi. She'd come back 3 times. 3 times into active fire zones to pull out people bleeding out in the sand. And then she'd gone quiet. Disappeared. One day she was in the daily briefing photos, the next day the Pentagon scrubbed her from every official record. Transfer, they'd said. Reassignment, they'd said. Nobody said where. But Webb had been there. Webb had been one of the 8 she'd pulled out on the 3rd run. He remembered her face across his visor display as she was dragging him toward the extraction point, remembered the control in her voice when his vision started tunneling, remembered thinking, that's the calmest person I've ever heard, and we're about to die. He looked at the live news feed now. Cedar Creek Medical, Atlanta. Active shooter disarmed by staff member. Video already circulating, she was just standing there, and then she wasn't, and then the man was on the floor breathing like a broken accordion. Webb's hand started shaking. The termination notice arrived at the nurse's station at 4:52 p.m. Director Hammond handed it to Rachel personally, away from the main floor, in the back hallway near the pharmacy. His hand showed it to her, but his eye showed something different, something like apology mixed with powerlessness. I'm sorry, Rachel. It's Regulation 47C, unauthorized physical intervention. We don't have a choice. Rachel's jaw was swollen now, her left eye starting to close at the corner, her scrub stained with blood that had already begun to oxidize from bright red to brown. She read the notice without moving her lips, without changing her breathing pattern. Effective immediately. 2-week severance. References available upon request. The signature line showed both Hammond and Mercer. She set the paper down on the counter and nodded once. "I understand, sir." Across the ER floor, Dr. Mercer watched her from the medication station. He was trying to look busy, pulling syringes, checking labels, but his eyes kept tracking her movements. He was watching for the moment she'd break. The moment she'd realize she'd been destroyed. The moment she'd understand that rules were rules, and she'd violated them, and there was no fixing it. Rachel walked to her locker without making eye contact with anyone. The staff parted for her like she was radioactive. The faded purple locker, the cheap kind with a built-in lock that clicked open with her employee code, hung at chest height. Inside, she'd kept exactly 3 things: a change of scrubs, a deodorant stick, and 1 faded Special Forces unit patch. Hand-sewn into a canvas backing. The edges fraying just slightly. The colors worn from years of being carried in a cargo pocket through desert heat and dust storms and the kind of humidity that made cotton feel like a second skin. She touched it one more time. Her fingers came away dry. Below the patch, on a magnetic clip she'd installed the second week, hung a photograph. 8 by 10. Color. A young man in dress blues, hair military short, smile that reached his eyes. No name on the back. No date. Just the fact that he was standing in that uniform, and he was her son, and this was the last photograph taken of him before Ramadi made sure there would be no others. Rachel closed the locker. The click of the lock sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. She turned and walked toward the exit without changing her expression. Without meeting anyone's eyes. Without the trembling that would have made her human, would have made her understandable, would have made her just another nurse whose life had just collapsed. Instead she moved like someone stepping out of rain, unaffected, unchanged, like the water had never touched her at all. Dr. Mercer watched her go, and his smile was thin and precise, and he was already thinking about tomorrow's schedule, about how much better the ER would run without her, about how he'd finally taken action instead of just making noise. He would not smile tomorrow. He would not smile for very long after that. The security officer's pen scraped across the incident report form. Rachel sat motionless in exam room 7, an ice pack pressed against her jaw, her teeth aching where the gunman's swing had connected. She'd taken harder hits in Kandahar. This was nothing. The officer was asking her something, protocol questions about de-escalation, about why she'd intervened, about her training. She answered in fragments. Minimal. Precise. Just the observable facts. The gunman entered. She positioned herself between him and the pregnant nurse at triage. He swung. She disarmed him. He fell. The officer kept waiting for more, kept asking follow-up questions that assumed civilians didn't move like soldiers when bullets started flying. Rachel gave him nothing else. "Did you receive any formal training in hand-to-hand combat?" the officer asked. No. It wasn't a lie. She'd received formal training in tactical assault, close-quarters combat, and lethal force deployment. But that wasn't hand-to-hand combat the way civilians understood it. That was something else entirely. Something that belonged to a woman who didn't exist anymore. The ice pack dripped water onto her scrubs. The officer finished his statement at 4:56 p.m. Rachel signed it without reading it. Her signature was precise, controlled, the penmanship of someone who could hold a rifle steady at 300 meters and never let the tremor show in her hands. By 5:41 p.m., Dr. Mercer had filed his incident report. Rachel knew this because a nurse named Stephanie, one of the few who'd been kind to her, found her in the break room and whispered it like contraband. "He's written you up for violating de-escalation protocols," Stephanie said, her voice tight with anger and fear. "He's claiming you endangered patients through unsanctioned physical intervention. That you acted outside your scope of practice as a temporary nurse." Rachel nodded slowly. Of course he had. Mercer couldn't let this stand. A temporary nurse with no credentials had done what an emergency room full of physicians and security personnel couldn't do. She'd neutralized a lethal threat in 4 seconds. No hesitation. No panic. No calling for backup from someone with more authority. For a man like Mercer, that was an existential threat. By 6:15 p.m., the paperwork had multiplied. A hospital administrator named Patricia Donovan arrived at the nurse's station with a cardboard box and a manila folder that was, remarkably, an inch thick. Rachel stood. She already knew what was coming. She could read the trajectory of a crisis the way other people read weather patterns. "Miss Torres," Donovan said, not meeting her eyes. "We need to process your termination. Effective immediately." Rachel didn't ask why. She already knew. The folder contained citations of protocol violations, references to hospital regulations section 7.3.2 and 8.1.4, allegations of insubordination dating back weeks, now culminating in today's egregious breach of de-escalation standards. Mercer had built something elegant, bureaucratically speaking. Every citation was accurate. Every regulation was real. He hadn't forged anything, he'd simply weaponized the system itself. That was how competent predators worked. They didn't lie. They just arranged the truth in ways that served them. "You'll need to collect your belongings," Donovan continued, setting the cardboard box on the counter. It was the kind of box that held reams of copy paper. Small. Practical. Humiliating in its ordinariness. Rachel gathered what she'd accumulated in 8 months at Cedar Creek. A cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse," a gift from the only other temp who'd lasted more than a week, before Mercer had pushed her out too. A wilted succulent in a ceramic pot, browning at the edges because Rachel had forgotten to water it consistently. You couldn't keep anything alive when you were too busy staying invisible. And the photograph. The photograph was the only thing that mattered. Her son. Lieutenant Daniel Torres, dress blues, 24 years old, face smooth and bright and alive, taken 3 months before the convoy outside Ramadi went wrong. Before he stayed dead. Before Rachel came back changed into something that couldn't be allowed to exist on official records. The security guard escorted her to the parking lot. Rain was falling hard over Atlanta, the kind of rain that hammered like applause against the asphalt. Rachel stood at the bus stop on the corner of Peach Street, clutching the cardboard box to her chest, the rain soaking through her jacket, soaking through the polyester scrubs beneath it, soaking through to the faded unit patch she kept sewn inside the jacket lining, the only piece of her old life she'd been allowed to keep. The only thing that proved she'd ever been real. She stared at the photograph through the plastic evidence bag where she'd kept it pristine, untouched, the way a shrine keeper tends a candle. Daniel's smile. Daniel's eyes. Daniel in a uniform that meant everything. She'd given 8 months pretending to be nobody at Cedar Creek Medical because the Pentagon had ordered her to be nobody. She'd survived for 6 years in the spaces between identities, not Captain Torres, not Rachel's old life, not quite anyone else either. And now even that was gone. The bus route number 42 pulled up to the stop. Rachel didn't move. The doors hissed open and closed. The bus moved on, spraying dirty water across the curb. She stood in the rain with a cardboard box and a ghost and the photograph of a son who died 6 years ago holding off enemy fighters in a city where his mother had earned a silver star she could never claim. Her phone rang at 7:13 p.m. Unknown number. She didn't answer. It rang again at 7:19 p.m. Again at 7:24 p.m. The third time, she looked at the screen. The fourth time, she answered. Ms. Torres. A voice she didn't recognize. Male. Urgent. This is Sergeant Major Clayton with the Marine Corps Historical Division. I'm calling from Colonel James Webb's hospital room. He's asked me to reach out. He says it's urgent that you return to Cedar Creek immediately. Rachel's jaw tightened. The ice pack had numbed the pain, but underneath it, her face was throbbing. I've been terminated. Yes. Colonel Webb is aware. He's asked me to inform you that your termination is going to be invalidated within the next hour. Please come back. The rain drummed against the cardboard box. Rachel looked at the photograph of her son. She thought about 8 months of being invisible. She thought about the penalty for surfacing, for letting anyone know what Captain Rachel Torres had been before the Pentagon erased her. She thought about Colonel James Webb lying in room 347, about the way he'd watched her with recognition in his eyes that no stranger should possess. On my way, she said, and disconnected. She set the cardboard box on the bench at the bus stop. It looked small against the Atlanta evening. Insignificant. The rain would probably ruin the mug. The succulent was already dead. But the photograph was sealed. She walked back towards Cedar Creek Medical, her pace steady, her breathing controlled. The rain plastered her scrubs to her skin. Water dripped from her hair. By the time she reached the hospital entrance, she was soaked through, but her hands were steady and her eyes were clear. A nurse named Marcus met her at the emergency room doors. Colonel Webb has been calling for you all evening. He's in room 347. But Rachel, Marcus hesitated. Dr. Mercer's in the administrator's office with Mrs. Donovan right now, and there's someone else. Someone in a dark suit. They look like federal. Rachel nodded once and moved toward the patient wing, her wet scrubs leaving brief footprints on the tile that would evaporate within minutes. By the time she reached room 347, the footprints would be gone. There would be no evidence she'd ever walked this way. Colonel Webb was sitting up in bed despite his injuries, watching the doorway with an intensity that hadn't diminished since this morning. When he saw her, he extended his hand. Rachel took it. His grip was stronger than it should have been for a man recovering from a car accident. Military grip. Recognition grip. The grip of someone who'd spent years learning to read other soldiers from across a battlefield. "Captain," he said quietly, so only she could hear. Rachel's breathing accelerated. No one had called her that in 6 years. No one was allowed to know that rank existed anymore. "Phantom," he whispered. "I've been waiting 6 years to find you. To tell you that your son died saving my life. That he died being the warrior you taught him to be. And I'm going to make sure the world knows you're real again." The rain outside sounded like distant rotor blades. Rachel's hand trembled, not from fear, but from something much more dangerous, the possibility that being erased wasn't permanent. That the dead could still call you home. The administrator's office door opened at 9:24 a.m. on a Tuesday, and Dr. Mercer walked out with the kind of smug expression that only comes from believing you finally won. He held Rachel's termination papers like they were a trophy, still wet from his signature, and his voice carried across the administrative wing with the confidence of a man who'd just buried his competition. He'd already made the calls, 3 of them, to contacts he'd cultivated over 15 years of networking with hospital boards, insurance companies, and a man named Leonard Kessler who dealt in the kind of information that didn't exist officially but could be manufactured for the right price. $5,000. That's what it cost to get someone to fabricate evidence that Rachel Torres had forged her nursing credentials. Mercer had paid it in cash, via an offshore account, with a kind of careful anonymity he thought made him invisible. He didn't know that every attempt to access Rachel's erased file triggered an alarm at the Pentagon. Not the Pentagon's Public Relations Office, the Office of Special Access Programs, specifically the Joint Special Operations Command's classified personnel database. He didn't know that an automated alert had pinged a secure server at Fort Bragg the moment Kessler's shell company tried to breach the system. He didn't know that 6 years of attempts to access Captain Rachel Torres's classified military record had been logged, cross-referenced, and flagged by counterintelligence officers whose entire job was protecting erased operatives from exposure. By 10:15 a.m., the FBI field office in Atlanta had received a secure cable from the Pentagon. By 10:27 a.m., a special agent named Morrison was reviewing the attempted breach with a historian from SOCOM who specialized in Special Forces personnel records. By 11:08 a.m., Morrison was walking through Cedar Creek Medical's front entrance with a federal warrant and 2 uniformed colleagues. Dr. Mercer was in his office when they found him, reorganizing Rachel's file into a folder marked Terminated Personnel. His face had that satisfied look, the expression of a bureaucrat who believed he'd finally managed to game a system that had eluded him. "Dr. Mercer," the agent said, not as a greeting but as a statement of location. "I'm Special Agent Morrison, Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to talk about Leonard Kessler." Mercer's hand stilled. The folder in his grip lowered slightly. "I don't know who that is." Morrison pulled out a tablet, placed it on Mercer's desk, and let the screen speak for him. Bank transfer confirmations. Email correspondence. A detailed log of every attempt to access classified military personnel records. The evidence was organized, dated, and utterly damning. 3 days ago, Morrison continued, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority, you attempted to access classified military personnel records through Mr. Kessler's information brokerage. You paid $5,000 to obtain fabricated evidence that would prove Rachel Torres forged her nursing credentials. You were trying to create documentation that didn't exist because you couldn't find anything real. Mercer's complexion shifted, the color draining like someone had opened a drain in his chest. I was just verifying her background. As chief of this ER, I have a responsibility to. You don't have any responsibility here anymore, Morrison said. When you couldn't find dirt on her real identity, you attempted to manufacture evidence. You didn't verify anything. You committed falsification of military records, identity fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Those are federal crimes. The office suddenly felt smaller. The walls seemed closer, pressing in. Mercer's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, searching for words that wouldn't come. The second FBI agent moved to the doorway. The third was already radioing for backup. They moved with the practiced precision of people who'd done this before, who understood that the moment of realization, when the suspect understood they'd made catastrophic errors, was the moment that separated the compliant from the desperate. Mercer looked at them and chose compliance, his shoulders sagging. Then the door opened again, and a woman in a navy suit entered. The hospital's director, Hammond. Her face was pale, aged 10 years in the last hour. Behind her stood the SOCOM historian, a retired Colonel Webb's handler from years ago, holding a tablet displaying Rachel's full classified service record. Not the redacted version. The real one. Dr. Mercer, Hammond said, her voice carrying no emotion, only fact, you are terminated effective immediately. Security is waiting to escort you from the building. Your medical license suspension will be processed by the state board within 48 hours. The handcuffs came out. Not with drama or theater, just procedure. Morrison recited the Miranda rights with the cadence of someone who'd memorized them through repetition, and Dr. Mercer's hands went behind his back without resistance. The metal clicked around his wrists with a sound like a door closing on an entire life. The walk out of Cedar Creek Medical's ER became the moment everyone in the hospital would remember for years. Mercer in handcuffs, flanked by federal agents, moving through the hallway he'd once commanded with the authority of a surgeon who believed his credentials elevated him above consequences. The nurses stepped back. The resident stopped mid-sentence. The attending physicians watched in stunned silence as the man who'd bullied them, who'd held power over their schedules and their reputations, was led away like a common criminal. Kim, the pregnant nurse Rachel had shielded from the gunman, started clapping. Just 3 sharp sounds, her hands coming together with the kind of clarity that only comes from genuine relief. Then another nurse joined. Then another. By the time Mercer reached the elevator, more than a dozen people were clapping, and the sound followed him down the corridor like a soundtrack to his collapse. His face had gone gray, not the color of illness, but the color of a man watching his entire world disintegrate in real time. 10 years ago, he'd been celebrated. 5 years ago, he'd been powerful. This morning, he believed he was untouchable. By noon, he was in federal custody. Rachel watched from Colonel Webb's doorway, her expression unchanged, her composure intact. No satisfaction. No visible emotion. Just observation. The same stillness she'd maintained through 6 months of humiliation, through the gunman's punch, through the moment she'd lost her job and walked into the Atlanta rain with nothing but a cardboard box. But something shifted in her chest, some tight knot that had lived there since Ramadi finally loosening, finally allowing her to breathe. When the echo of Mercer's removal finally faded, when the hallway returned to the controlled chaos of a functioning emergency room, Rachel turned and stepped back into Colonel Webb's room. He was crying, not the quiet tears of emotion, but deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere ancient and broken. His right hand was extended, palm open, waiting. Rachel reached into her jacket lining, the place where she'd sewn it years ago when she'd reported for duty at Cedar Creek Medical as a ghost, a nobody, a temp nurse with a falsified past. The faded Special Forces unit patch, worn at the edges, the stitching coming loose in places, came free from the fabric. Green and gold. The insignia of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, the unit her son had served with. The unit she'd served with. The unit that had told her that Captain Rachel Torres no longer existed. She placed it in Webb's palm. Not slowly, not ceremonially, just a transfer of an object from one hand to another. But the meaning was everything. Webb's fingers closed around it, and the sobs intensified. His voice, when it came, was fractured and raw. "Danny gave me this the day before the ambush. He said his mom was the toughest soldier he'd ever known. He said if he didn't make it home, I should find the ghost and tell her he was proud. That his last memory was watching her move through incoming fire like she owned the ground beneath her feet. Like she was the thing the enemy should be afraid of." Rachel's composure fractured, not completely, but enough. One tear. Then another. Her jaw tightened. Her breathing became measured, controlled, but the tears came anyway because 6 years of silence had a weight, and hearing your dead son's name spoken aloud by someone who'd lived because of you was a breaking point even captains couldn't pass through without bleeding. "He was your son," Webb continued, his hand shaking. "And he saved my life. And I spent 6 years looking for a woman who officially never existed. Phantom. The ghost they told me was a story, a legend, a call sign that had been erased from every database except the ones locked behind classified doors. But you're here. You were always here. Just hiding." Rachel reached for a chair. Sat down. Composed herself. The nurse returned, settling into place like armor, but something fundamental had changed. The ghost had a face again. The erased had been restored. The name on her scrubs could finally match the name in her heart. By 3 p.m., Cedar Creek Medical's administrator had been contacted by federal personnel handling her case. By 4 p.m., she'd received a secure call from the Pentagon confirming her identity and requesting her formal reinstatement. By evening, Rachel Torres, Captain Rachel Torres, had been offered her position back. Not as a temp nurse. As the new trauma coordinator. Her military medical experience, her combat triage training, her capability to function at the highest level under catastrophic pressure, all of it suddenly valuable, suddenly recognized, suddenly celebrated. The one thing the audience should know, some people are forged in fire, and they don't come out diminished. They come out harder. Better. Unbreakable. And when those people finally stop hiding, when they finally let the world see who they really are, the impact trembles across every life they touch. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit that like button. And I'd love to know, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from.